Peleg, Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of Law at UNSW. I warmly welcome you to this webinar, which is part of the Children's Rights webinar series organised and hosted by the Diplomacy Training Programme in partnership with Youth Law Australia and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. This webinar series aims to build knowledge and understanding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child at both state and territory levels. So some housekeeping rules, first of all, if you can please mute your sound and post any questions or comments in the chat function box throughout the event, that would be very much appreciated. Before I formally open the webinar and welcome our esteemed guest speakers today, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land this university stands and pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded, and it was and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge all Indigenous people who are participating in the webinar today or who will listen to the recording afterwards, and I pay my respects to your elders past and present. Today's webinar is on the topic of advancing children's rights via the UN reporting mechanism, and we're looking at the role of the UN and children's commissioners. It will focus on the CRC reporting process, the opportunities that process provides to facilitate dialogue between all of those involved in children's rights reporting and implementation, to agree on priorities and to analyse barriers to implementation and any existing concerns. It will have a focus on the CRC reporting cycle in Australia and on the UN CRC's committee's concluding observations in response to Australia's 5th and 6th reports to the committee in 2019. The CRC reporting process has particular significance for children's commissioners at state, territory and federal levels throughout the entire reporting cycle, including implementation of the committee's recommendations. And Australia's next report is due in January 2024. So there's a very vibrant children's rights sector here in Australia doing a lot of very important work. And I'd like to cross-promote an event that the ANU Children's Policy Centre are hosting next week, Wednesday the 6th of April at lunchtime. Professor Sharon Bessell will be in conversation with one of our speakers today, Natalie Lewis, Commissioner at the QFCC, about prioritising the rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. That's another not to be missed webinar, and details of that will hopefully be posted in the chat box for you to sign up to if you're interested. Each presentation today will be around 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a chaired question and answer session led by Dr. Noam Peleg, who will also draw this webinar to a close. So I'd now like to warmly welcome and introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Justice Vinu Clarence Nelson. Justice Nelson sits on the Supreme Court of Samoa, and he was the first Pacific Island judge appointed to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And we very much appreciate Justice Nelson being here today. We're really looking forward to hearing and learning from all of your insights, Justice Nelson. And our second contribution is from the Queensland Family and Child Commission. A warm welcome to Natalie Lewis and Luke Twyford. So Natalie is a Gamarai woman and a QFCC commissioner. She was CEO of the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection Peak for 8 years and has held a wide range of numerous appointments on boards and on councils that have really driven significant reform in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child protection and family services sectors. And Luke is Chief Executive and Commissioner of the Queensland Family and Child Commission. Luke worked for 9 years in the Northern Territory government, leading very critical reforms in the child protection system and its legal frameworks. And this included legislating a charter of rights for children in care. So I welcome our speakers very warmly today, and over to you now, Justice Nelson, to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faith, for the introduction. And as you mentioned, and for the purposes of an introduction, I'm Clarence Nelson, and a member of the Committee of the Rights of the Child. Very, very happy to be here and to speak to you today about the role that stakeholders play in the reporting process to committees such as ours, and also to say something about the concluding observations of the committee and in general the work of the committee. But before I do that, I just want to publicly record, as a member of the committee and on behalf of the committee, our thanks to all those who make this kind of program possible, the Diplomacy Training Program. It's an excellent initiative that we heartily encourage. And certainly it's not only valuable in awareness raising, but very educational, very informative, and gives people a lot of information about the CRC and the work that the committee does. We have very limited time today. I understand this. I have a lot that I can say. You know, judges are well known for going on and speaking at length, according to lawyers, sometimes about nothing. But I'll try to be as brief as I can, because time, as we say in the committee, time is not on our side. And there are other speakers too that we should hear from. I thought if I can just put up, I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, which is a general presentation that I am sure Faith will, or someone will share with all the participants of this meeting afterwards. But I would just propose to go through the main parts of this presentation. I'll leave the other parts for everyone to read at their leisure, because it is of rather a general nature. But for our purposes, I will focus on just a few of the main slides. It's a presentation that deals generally with the history and scope of the CRC and the work of the committee. And I thought it might be useful if we go straight to page 5 of the presentation and just do a little quick run through about the origins of the CRC and the CRC committee. A lot of people perhaps are not aware that the original Declaration of the Rights of the Child was in 1984 and was adopted by the League of Nations at that time. And it has in the preamble one of my favorite of all-time quotes concerning the sort of spirit and intent behind the CRC, where it says, recognizing that mankind owes to the child the best that it has to give. I think that's just a beautiful phraseology that captures the intent and spirit of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And as you can see from that historical summary, this led to the Declaration being adopted by the United Nations in 1959, and eventually to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, and the 3 protocols to that convention, OPEC in 2000, OPSC in 2000 as well, and the OPIC in 2011. For the information of everyone, this is the current status of signatories or ratifications to the CRC and the optional protocols. CRC, of course, has been signed or ratified by every country in the world except the United States of America. And signatories currently stand at 196. For OPEC, 170. For OPSC, 176. For OPIC, sadly, a very low number of 41. I think that is still, that reflects that a lot of states are still uncertain about being bound to this communication complaints procedure, because it is effectively a complaints mechanism that can be utilized to bring complaints against state parties to the protocol. the next slides deal with the features of the convention itself, but the main part is this one, the general principles, the four general principles of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. The principle of non-discrimination in Article 2, the best interests of the child principle in Article 3, the right to life, survival, and development in Article 6, and the respect for views of the child in Article 12. You may be interested to know that we are currently working on our latest general comment on child's rights and the environment with a focus on climate change. And as we go deeper and deeper into that general comment and how it's going to be formulated, we have found that all these principles are brought to the fore. They are very practical principles with practical applications that are applied not only in the general comments of the committee, but also in its practices and its concluding observations. The CRC deals with a whole range of rights, civil rights, political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are, I've tried to list them there in that particular order. When parties report to our committee, the reports are framed generally along these lines, and the dialogue is usually conducted along these lines and according to these clusters. We call them clusters for the purposes of discussion and consultation with committee. There's a nice little picture of us all looking very handsome on the steps of our meeting room in Geneva. There's 18 of us in the committee. What do? We meet 3 times a year, and we review the state party reports in a process called a constructive dialogue process. We also deal with individual communications and inquiries, which are under the OPIC protocol. And of course, there are the general comments that are issued from time to time. So roughly once every 2 years by the committee. And as I said, the current one we're working on is relation to climate change. And then, of course, we have the days of general discussion, which we do every 2 years. We pick a topic and we delve into it over a period of 2 days by way of a day of general discussion in Geneva. Moving along now, this is probably we're getting to the meat and bones of what the committee process is all about. As you are all aware, the parties report to the committee, and the purpose of the review is to assess progress and challenges in the national implementation of their right of children's rights, and particularly to make recommendations to states. We do this through a process of reviews which involves submissions of reports from NGOs, UN agencies, and especially from children. Children's reports are confidential, and this is extremely important, as are the reports themselves to the committees. Based on all this, we then conduct this dialogue and issue concluding observations to state parties. That's an overview of the process, but there are two or three issues that I want to highlight about the reporting. Firstly, the current reporting cycle is after the first report is filed, then it's every 5 years. The state parties are required to report, and there is an opt-in option using what we call the simplified reporting procedure. It's a simpler procedure for reporting, as it's called, the simplified reporting procedure. There's a lot of information about it on the website that we have. There is a new website that we've developed that I would urge people who want to investigate this further to look under reporting guidelines. It gives you a lot of pointers and help in terms of formulating reports to the committee. The simplified reporting procedure, currently only 26 states use it. We have found that very surprising. We thought that when we came out with a simplified reporting procedure. And we did so because states were complaining about how complicated the procedure was. So we thought if we simplified it, that states would all sign up for it. Sad to say, only 26 have opted to use it. I don't think Australia has opted to use this procedure as yet, although we have invited Australia and the many other countries to take advantage of it. Why this is becoming more and more important is now, the future trend now is for all treaty bodies in the UN mechanism, including the CRC, to begin moving towards a predictable review cycle, a different kind of review cycle of an 8-year review with a mid-cycle review after 4 years, focusing on the 6 main areas identified in the concluding observations. And this would be coupled with making the simplified reporting procedure an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system. So it would, the new system would involve all states agreeing to being bound by the simplified reporting procedure unless they specifically opt out and use the traditional way. It's designed, of course, to encourage states to opt for the simplified reporting procedure, because we believe that that is a better process and a quicker process for state reporting. Whichever system is used, it is absolutely essential and critical to the work that we do that civil society provides reports and input. These inputs come from all sectors of civil society. Children's commissioners, we are about to hear, are only sort of one such sectorial organization, but there are other NHRIs, ombuds people. There are also academics who file reports, specialist NGOs. There are a host of civil society organizations that file reports to the committee. And they are, as I said, and underlined in bold, absolutely essential and critical to our work. In this regard, the voices of children is particularly important. I'll give you an example that I refer to there. When I joined the committee in 2015, the committee had just finished issuing in 2013 a general comment on health and the right to sustain a highest degree of health. And in that general comment, if you look at it, there is only 1 or 2 paragraphs that actually refer to the issue of climate change. Of course, this was 2013. But since then, children who came to the committee identified climate change to the committee as one of the priority areas for them. And what has happened is this resulted over the years. If you look at all our concluding observations, you'll see more and more attention being paid to climate change, with the result that today we actually now have a specific section containing concluding observations on climate change. Now that is the impact that children's views have had on this one particular issue. There are also other areas, but on this one particular issue, it's very noticeable, and it's an example of how the committee responds to what children tell us, because ultimately, at the end of the day, as the Geneva Declaration said in 1924, we owe it to them to give them the best that we can. And sometimes, as I noted at the end, they surprise us. Children from Mongolia turned up in the committee in full traditional cultural dress, which was impressive. And they talked to us at length about their cultural identity and reminded us about Article 31 of the CRC, which talks about a child's cultural identity and the importance of that right to a child. Children often also remind us when we ask them, what is the most important right? A lot of them say something that we often overlook as adults, the right to play and the right to leisure. And you know, we were all children once. Our children may not believe that, but we were all children once. We all used to regard the right to play and the right to leisure it's an essential component of a happy childhood. They remind us about these things all the time. In my own country, in Samoa, when we had a special extraordinary session of the committee here, the children talked at length about corporal punishment, which again was a reminder about what to them is important. So all this, the reporting cycle process is very key to the work that we do. Also key to the work that we do are the concluding observations and their implementation. You know, without implementation of concluding observations, they're just nice words and aspirations on a piece of paper. They have to be implemented, and the obligation for that, as we all know, rests primarily on states, but it requires too the support of individual stakeholders, the NHRIs, the local government agencies, the state agencies. And it requires resources and capacities, which sometimes needs international cooperation with donor and aid agencies to provide financial support and technical assistance. This is especially true in the Pacific. A lot of child-related projects are achievable because of the low budgets of Pacific Island governments, are achievable because of international cooperation with donor agencies. And it's very, very critical to implementation of the COPs. There's also a reference in the CRC itself to articles specifically in relation to international cooperation. I won't go through those, but there are many UN agencies that governments work with. I cite the example of there from the concluding observations of Bhutan and Mongolia, UNICEF, all these projects involving UNICEF, ILO, WHO for Mongolia, but there are many others. And there are also other organizations that governments and stakeholders should look at. I'll give you an example of a surprise one. When we did the special session in Samoa for the CRC, I found out that the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, had decided finally that climate change and its links to Pacific economies was worth spending money and investment and resources to. We asked ADB, and ADB responded by sponsoring a one-day session in Samoa, in the Samoa meeting involving children. And they paid to bring children from all over the Pacific to come here and to talk to each other, to talk to us, and to talk to the world about climate change in the Pacific and how it impacted upon their lives. So, you know, these are examples, again, of stakeholders thinking outside the box, looking for other opportunities and looking for, in particular, ways and resources and funding to make these CRC-related rights obligations realistic and achievable. Finally, I would urge the stakeholder parties that are involved in this process not only to continue what they're doing now in terms of support in implementing the concluding observations, but to not overlook the fact that they too have a role in the state party report itself. In some countries, excuse me, in some countries, this is not welcomed by state parties. In other countries, and there is a trend for governments to now, when they prepare their reports, to call on stakeholders from the private sector and civil society to have an input, a large input into preparation of their reports. This does not mean that these non-government organizations should not still file reports to the committee. Please, we still want to receive your reports, but it's another way in which you can have your input into the work that we do is via the state party report. I think that's enough from me for the time being. As I say, I've probably gone over my time. Faith will tell me off But thank you very much for your attention and allowing me to make these few comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Nelson. Really important overview there, and we really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to picking up on a lot of that in the question answer session. So I'm going to move really swiftly on now to ask Natalie to start presenting. Thanks, Natalie.
No problem. Thank you. Can I just acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and I acknowledge all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may or may not be on this particular webinar, but that are actively involved in trying to promote the rights of our children across this country. I had the distinct privilege in 2019 to appear alongside the Australian Children's Commissioner and members of the Australian Child Rights Task Force to make a submission in the pre-sessions in our last periodic review. That responsibility to bring attention to the lived experience of our children and young people and the impacts of failing to make meaningful progress in the equitable enjoyment of their rights is starkly relevant for me today in my duties as a commissioner. Like some of you, I logged on at some obscene time to observe the Australian government's appearance at the committee during the last periodic review. At that conclusion of that session, after what sort of sounded like this collective chorus of nothing to see here, I felt embarrassed. I felt frustrated at not just the lack of progress, but the lack of acknowledgement that we could and must do better. But the committee's concluding observations gave me that assurance that the issues that have been raised by children, by civil society and by the National Children's Commissioner had been acknowledged and required action. The recommendations articulated that clear pathway to doing better. And I think that the information and the recommendations of the committee's reports are a really useful tool for Australians' children's rights advocates, but really important, I think, in the role of children's commissioners and guardians across all jurisdictions. The limitations of the reporting process can be that it represents the issues at scale. So when we look at aggregate data, it tells a whole of nation narrative. And in those big numbers, the unique experiences of cohorts of children in particular parts of Australia can be lost. So when we're applying such a wide lens, many children and young people who experience the most profound impacts of disadvantage are most often rendered invisible. That's a really important point that, that actually communicates an obligation that commissioners have in that we need to see those kids. We need to actually engage them in the process and make sure that their issues are communicated loudly through all of these reporting processes. I think that more intentional involvement in the UPR process by states, children's commissioners and guardians is a really important opportunity to maintain the visibility of the rights and the urgency of issues that are facing the children in our country that experience the most profound vulnerability, injustice and marginalisation. It's an opportunity for us to capture the nuance of place and to communicate what is working well and what requires urgent action in the interests of our children. So while there's not a particular, set of rules for us that is prescribed specifically for children's commissioners in different jurisdictions about how we engage, I think that collectively we can create a pathway to make sure that there is routine observation and reporting into the process to ensure that those jurisdictional issues are given due weight in the submissions made. The absence of Commonwealth government leadership in children's rights is not an excuse for our inaction. We've got the ability to commit to and promote a child rights agenda in each of our jurisdictions. And in Queensland, that is a rights affirming jurisdiction through the enactment of our Queensland Human Rights Act. So while I'm just conscious of the time, but the National Children's Commissioner and state-based children's commissioners and guardians have a unique vantage point to observe, report and drive changes to improve upon the realisation of the rights of children and young people in this country. So while I acknowledge that we all operate under different legislative frameworks, we all have different functions, powers, and levels of independence and resourcing. The thing that I've found to be the common thread that binds all the members of the Australian New Zealand Children's Commissioner and Guardians Group is a fierce commitment to promoting and upholding the rights of children and young people in this country. So at the QFCC, we're really committed to embedding the UNCRC into the DNA of our organisation to shape what we do, how we do it, and most importantly, why we do it. And it's probably no secret that I would love to see the convention firmly embedded into our legislative framework. Our legislation is currently being reviewed. And while we've been able to work maybe with some creative license to implement a child rights approach within our current program of work, we are absolutely well placed to understand how well children's rights are being respected, protected, and fulfilled in the state of Queensland. Exploring that effectiveness of the positive measures to ensure rights are considered and upheld in policy and lawmaking, but also in the practice, the interactions and interfaces between statutory systems and the children and young people themselves is a unique opportunity for us to understand whether we've been able to safeguard the intent of legislation that is about protecting rights through to the experience of service delivery and practice that impacts children and young people. Let me say, the concluding observations from 2019's review gave us really clear guidance and points to issues that we can keep on our radar as we plan our program of work. So regarding the 2019 observations, for example, addressing issues such as violence against children, mental health needs, and the disproportionate representation of First Nations children in statutory systems absolutely align with the program of work of our commission. So we are then very well placed to comment on progress that's been made on the observations and provide evaluations at a jurisdictional level. Let me see, if we're going to be able to successfully embed a child rights approach across the entirety of our work at the Commission, engaging in or contributing to the UPR processes is not just another thing to do. It will actually become an extension of the accountability function that we already perform as Children's Commissioners. It's about extending that story of children's rights beyond the border and contributing in a more deliberate and meaningful way to upholding our obligations at international law. There are a couple of solid examples, I think, of the shift that we're making that might be of interest. And I think some of our staff who are logged in might be much quicker than me about uploading those into the chat. Let me see, we have certainly in recent times, we've developed a child rights impact assessment and a user guide, which we're actively using to guide our submissions to inquiries. We've released Rights Voices Stories, which is a great example of youth-led commission-supported work. We've released our youth participation model and quick start guide to support other agencies and service providers to embed child and youth participation in their decision-making. We've used a child rights approach to examining the issue of overrepresentation in our principal focus program of work. And while it's not yet released, we're really looking forward to the launch of our strategy to guide the QFCC's child death prevention activities over the next 5 years. I think it's another really great example of how we've applied a child rights approach in our work. So the progress that we've been made has really only been possible because of the collective commitment of our QFCC staff. I know there's a few of them on the line at the moment. I want to give them a shout out. They are truly exceptional. And also the willingness of our friends and our colleagues within the Australian Child Rights Network to lend their time and their wisdom to build our organisational expertise. So people like John Tobin and James McDougall and Mick Gooder have made themselves available to yarn with staff. But of course, that partnership we have established with that brilliant team at DTP, so Faith and Noam and Claire, has been absolutely for us a game changer. So I really look forward to continuing to work with them as they help us to have a long-term development program to create an army of child rights advocates in Queensland. That journey for us is going to be long because this this isn't a fad for us. It hasn't been without its challenges, and I'm reminded that it is worth every time that challenge has been worth it. Every single time I look at one of our pieces of work and see the full and faithful translation of a child rights approach, I see a greatly enhanced capacity to create influence and impact to uphold the rights of children and young people in Queensland. And I think that we really can help our institutions and our community find our way back to that point of agreement that was signified by Australia's ratification of the UNCRC, and finally make good on that promise that we made to our kids. So I know I've probably chewed up a whole lot of time. And I thank our new Principal Commissioner, Luke Twyford, for being patient and for learning very quickly that brevity is not my strong point. So I have limited the amount of time he has, but if I can hand over to Luke, that would be awesome.
Thank you, Natalie, and no issues at all with brevity when there's so much passion there that you're presenting. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luke Twyford. I'm here to support the work of the QFCC and to learn from Natalie and others around what this work means. I don't have very much to say that can add to what Commissioner Lewis has just outlined, other than I think there's some critical points for me coming from the bureaucracy of government into a commission and starting to test for myself why it's easier to take a child rights-based approach in a children's commission and harder to do it when you're part of the bigger system of government. And I think my learnings thus far are that there is no difference. It's around courage of it as a system and leadership. And I think what the QFCC has been able to do in its products and the way it approaches work, but in particular, the way it embeds youth participation and the voices of children in everything it does, are shining examples of what governments can do. My final point that I would like to make is the process of federalism in Australia. I think we do need to question why each department and each jurisdiction needs to create its own tools and resources to apply a child rights approach, and why we spend so much time deliberating and discussing tools when in fact we just need to get on and implement what the United Nations and other nations have already designed and implemented and what we already hold for ourselves. So I did see a comment in the chat as Commissioner Lewis was speaking around why are we still designing products? And I think that's a very important question for us right across the board. And my only answer is the great difficulty of 7 jurisdictions in Australia, each approaching their own similar complex problems through their own lens, rather than a coalition of effort and a unifying focus on rights as the underlying foundation. So I'll leave it there. I just want to say thank you to everyone for the invitation, and thank you, Natalie, for representing not just the QFCC, but the rights of children in what you've just presented.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, look. Or sorry, no, I was just going to hand over to you. I will do that. Okay. Thank you, no.
Thank you, Faith. Sorry, line of cross here. And thank you for all our 3 speakers, Judge Nelson, Commissioner Lewis, and Commissioner Twyford, for a very interesting and useful presentation for us as we move forward and we try to see how we can promote child rights on the ground. As Natalie was saying, it takes a village. The say is it takes a village to raise a child, as Natalie's presentation alludes to. It takes a village also to create a child rights community and to promote child rights on the ground. And I'm pleased that all of us with the DTP and our partners can contribute to that effort. Let's kickstart with some questions, and please, everyone who are with us today, please pop your question in the chat function. And I would like also just to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that on their ceded land I'm joining you from, and to extend my respect to any Indigenous person here in this room with us, or that will listen to this recording of this webinar in the future. Judge Nelson, I might start with you. You described to us in very clear details, in very clear terms, how the committee works and the value of civil society participation and how the committee observe implementation on the ground. And I was wondering, reflecting on the 6 or 7 years that you've been sitting on the committee, if you can give us 1 or 2 examples for best practices in terms of local implementations that you see coming before you, that we can learn from.
Thank you, Noah. I think the best way to answer that would be to say that in my experience, the best experiences have been country driven, have been not where an expert advisor goes into a country and say, well, I've been engaged and consulted to come and talk to you about corporal punishment or the issue of violence against children. But the best responses have been where the initiatives have come from in country, and they themselves have tried to resolve the problem in their own jurisdiction and called on international help to assist, but not to provide the solution. So, I found that that's a good model that works in many different settings in many different countries, rather than the traditional model, which was always that you hire the expert, he comes in and he tells you what he thinks you should do. I think that's the best way to answer that without sort of getting into concrete examples.
Thank you. So the bottom-up approach is much more preferable. So let's go to the ground. And I was wondering, Natalie, if you can tell us about, you described some of the initiatives the impressive initiatives that the QFCC is taking while waiting to any change in legislation that might embed child rights in Queensland Human Rights Act or not. But nonetheless, you can change things on the ground. And you've mentioned changes that you took to your practices and the ways in which you engage with children and consultation around children in various ways. What sorts of examples for a good practice you can share with us that was developed locally in Queensland that can be maybe shared in other jurisdictions in Australia and beyond as well?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Noam. I think there's probably a really significant shift that we've made around understanding what best practice looks like in terms of participation of children and young people. And so, we can kind of look backwards and see that there's sort of these examples where children are placed it's like on a production line, right? And then we do some consultation at particular points. But what we would see in in those pieces of work is that they were never actually truly formed and thought through and developed based on the rights of those children and led by an attempt to address the issues that the young people had actually articulated. So one of the things that I'm really confident about with our work now is that it absolutely privileges the full and active participation of children and young people that are most impacted by the issue that we're investigating or reviewing or considering. So one example of that is we're doing a piece of work under an election commitment around the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people that are in contact with the youth justice system. So the suggestion to us was that we do a survey. Well, what we know is that is not the most appropriate means to engage those young people. They're their voices that we never hear because we had never actually placed ourselves in positions to listen. So one of the things we've done is obviously through a big ethics process, but our staff have actually been moving out of the safety of our office here on George Street and locating themselves in spaces where children who are profoundly impacted by their interactions with the youth justice system are. Detention centres, in community organisations where they're participating in diversionary work. So we are absolutely committed to reaching those young people, letting them set the terms of the engagement, and then paying our absolute attention to communicating what they tell us with some integrity. Even if we know that it's going to make the audience uncomfortable, we're really committed to making sure that we do that in a respectful and dignified way for kids.
Okay, thank you. So it's great to see that children in Queensland are getting a chance to participate in those processes. There was a question at the chat from Paula Grober to Judge Nelson about how the committee prefers to see a civil society report, whether a range of reports coming from one country about particular issues or different issues, whether a consolidated report like the one that the Child Rights Task Force has submitted in the case of Australia is a preferable one. On the chat, I can suggest that the consolidated one is better. I was wondering that, Judge Nelson, what's the value that you see in short and sweet reports being submitted by NGOs who have expertise about specific cohort of children or a specific issue that certain children faces, comparing to their big 20, 30, 40 pages long report that are results of maybe competing political motivations and range of expertise that are coming from certain jurisdictions. And if I can add, what will be the value of civil society reports versus reports that might come from independent human rights commission bodies like the commissioners we have here, the federal one or the state ones?
I think the first thing to emphasize, Norm, is that we do read everything. And whether the report is, 1 page, 2 pages, or 150 pages, I've found, and in my experience, certainly, that in the committee, it's a very exhaustive process of considering what's in the reports. And as I've said in the chat, it's a situation of, in this case, more is better. Consolidated reports are good from the viewpoint of organizational structure, so that when you have a consolidated report, you can cover a whole lot of issues in the one report, rather than giving us 20 separate reports from 20 different aspects. And while that may seem to be sort of adding to the workload, well, it really doesn't, because at the end of the day, once you try to digest everything that comes before the committee, you then distill the important bits. So the most important criteria is that we get the information, and how you present it. Every country is different, but if you ask my own personal preference, it would be that.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up question. In case there are some issues that are pressing on allocation and have mentioned by the committee in one concluding observations, 5 or 8 years have passed, depends on which reporting process you are engaging with, and things haven't changed, or at least they haven't improved as much as they should have. Would you like to see a follow-up report being submitted which reiterates previous concerns, or just a very short and sweet report saying these things hasn't been resolved? FYI, the committee, you might want to raise it with the relevant state delegates again.
Yes, I think it's good for that to be brought to the attention of the committee again. I mean, normally it's picked up. Normally it is picked up, because when we go through the analysis, we go through the previous concluding observations as well. So, but it's always good to be reminded about it. And if there and this is very common. There are many states who have not, over the series of maybe even 2 or 3 reporting cycles, they have still they are still being told, well, you said you were going to do this in 2005. It's now 2020. Why is it taking you 15 years? I mean, these are legitimate questions that we can ask, that we can and we do ask state parties. And the language, what we've evolved is a process where the language gets stronger and stronger, because that is the tool we have, is the language. And it's the only tool we have. So, they're sort of steps of seriousness, if you like. And ultimately, it becomes an issue, because I don't know that it's been done, but ultimately there is an ability under the convention to file a special report with the Secretary General in relation to the actions of any particular state. As I say, that would be, if you like, the ultimate step.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So in that, going back to the local level and to the implementation phase, 2 questions to Commissioner Lewis then. A, do you think that the Commission will engage in submitting its own report to the committee for the next cycle that Australia will be involved with? And on the similar note, what will you find to be useful? What will you expect to see in the future concluding observations for Australia that will make your life as a body who is tasked with holding the government to account easier, if there is any easier life in the human rights space?
Okay.
Thank you, Norm.
Sorry, it's Noam, did you ask me that question?
Yes.
Sorry, I just thought I was jumping in. Okay, so one of the things I think that we're able to do, and I'm going to watch Luke's face on this one, but I'm really committed for us to be able to develop by the end of this year a comprehensive child rights report card for the state of Queensland. And I think that, as I said earlier, we've got a really unique vantage point and this point in time with our legislation being reviewed where we can actually shift our gaze from being exclusively around the child protection system to actually look at and unpack those issues that are impacting kids in Queensland, like climate change, like health equity, like issues around access to, safe and stable housing. Those things absolutely impact every part of a young person's life. And I think as a Children's Commission, we need to be able to pull all of those things together rather than make particular, contributions that are primarily about one department in the state of Queensland. So I think that's something that we can commit to. I think the complication or maybe for us is actually understanding where our lane is. Like, what is the most appropriate mechanism for us to be able to fast track those perspectives and those issues for children in Queensland to the attention of the committee. Our concern previously when we look at that is that it's diluted so much because of the reporting at an international narrative. So those unique things that impact upon children in Queensland's like diverse regional and remote communities don't rate as highly in terms, don't get as much airtime in the consideration of the story of rights for children in Australia. So I'm really keen to explore the best and most appropriate way for us to be able to actively and directly engage in the UPR process.
Great, thank you. And for the second half of the question, what will help you do your job in terms of the concluded observations? What language would you like to see in it that will help you hold the local government to account and to advance child rights on the ground?
Oh, goodness. Would be lovely if the Australian government actually put something into place, stopped ignoring the first recommendation around developing a national plan for children's rights in this country, because that actually is a massive complication for us, because you end up with this tension where the Commonwealth and the states are buck passing responsibilities to take active efforts, to deliver on the rights of children. So that absence does complicate things, but at the same time, where we're seeing progress in terms of the rights of children is where people have made themselves aware of what the convention means for an everyday person as a duty bearer. We're not looking to government to be the only ones to hold responsibility for the rights of children. So where we see those local initiatives where people understand, embrace and value children and their rights, we're seeing the type of activity that gives you some faith that there's, that it's not all lost, So I think if we start to pay attention to those opportunities on the ground in local communities where a rights frame is thriving outside of the formality of things like our role. I think if we can focus on those things and start to build the momentum and change the standard about what working with children and working for children in a rights-based way, what that looks like, I think that's the only way I see to counter the lack of national leadership.
Thank you for that. I think it's an issue that keeps coming up on almost each and every webinar. It's about knowledge and it's about awareness to child rights and the fact that children are rights holders, and all of us as adults are duty bearers to an extent, either in our own little territory or in our professional capacity. I'm cautious with the fact we are getting closer to the end of our webinar, so I want to ask Judge Nelson for one quick last question. We know the committee is developing general comments about the rights of children and climate change. It follows also your decision about the individual complaint submitted to the committee like 3 years ago now by Greta Thunberg and a group of her colleagues, and the findings that the committee made last year about the applicability of the convention outside states' territories. So I was wondering, and now there is a process of consultation with civil society, governments, and children themselves about this coming general comment. And I was wondering if you can tell us something very briefly, if possible at all, of the shape that this general comment is taking and when it will be ready for us to use.
Thank you, Norm. Well, it's a bit early to sort of give you any information as to the shape it's going to take. What I can tell you for sure is that we were hoping to finalize this general comment by the end of this year or early next year at the latest. But because of the COVID delays that's caused our meetings, it's probably not going to be feasible. We're probably looking at about 1 year from now, realistically, at the earliest, before the general comment is produced. As you know, there's an extensive consultation process taking place. And right now, I think we're at the stage where children are completing a questionnaire. There's actually a questionnaire that has been posted online, and the invitation has been sent to children to complete this questionnaire. And we're getting, from what I hear, we're getting a response, overwhelming response, coming in from all parts of the globe. So we're probably going to bury ourselves in paperwork by doing this. But, you know, it is the importance of the consultation process. In terms of shape, I think the one complaint I have about it, the general comment shape, is we're tied to UN guidelines of a word limit. And that's going to mean when you try to economize on words in a document like that, it's going to make drafting it very difficult. Because one of the things we want to avoid is to say the things that have already been said in by many other international bodies. And you know, we want to say things that are also practical. I mean, this is designed to force states to do something better, to behave better, and to raise their levels of expectation. And we want the general comment to do that. And we don't want to be just repeating what everybody else is saying in many other documents. So it's going to be a difficult exercise, Norm, very difficult exercise indeed. But certainly I can't see it being completed inside a year from now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So we'll be keep our eyes open for mid-2023 publication of this general comment. It's nearly 2 o'clock and it's time to bring this webinar into an end. I would just add one thing before we conclude, that the issue of civil society engagement was raised time and again in this webinar, and we've mentioned in the past that the DTP, we are happy to support those organizations who would like to submit the report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So please feel free to contact us and we'll try to assist you in this process. I would like to thank all of our 3 participants, Judge Clarence Nelson from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, Natalie Lewis from Commissioner at the Queensland Family and Children Commission, and Luke Twyford, the Chief Executive and Principal Commissioner from QFCC, for their participation in today's webinar. And thank you all for logging in for our webinar today. We'll meet again in April, where we are likely to discuss the rights of refugee and asylum-seeking children. Invitations will be sent once we set a date and the list of speakers. Until then, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for our partners at Youth Law Australia and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, specifically sorry for the DTP, Claire Sidotti and Andrea Frankovic for organizing this webinar. Stay safe and have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone.